Early morning light filled the hospital room, softly enveloping the three women who stood guard by the man's bed. He lay silent, his once muscular body now emaciated from pain, eaten away from the inside by cancer. A petite brunette in her 40s pressed the man's hand to her cheek. Shoulder-length curly hair hid her beautiful tear-stained face. Next to her sat her copy, a woman of about 25. On the other side of the bed sat a 30-year-old, tall, attractive blonde woman with the same facial features as the man lying in the bed. She lovingly and carefully wiped her father's now bald head. Their silent vigil was interrupted by a quiet knock on the door. A tall, blonde man poked his head inside. "Little sister, is he awakey?" he asked the blonde in a whisper. "Not now, Tim," Angie replied. "He only wakes up for a short time. The morphine continues to put him to sleep." "Molly," he said softly, turning to the older brunette, "can we come in?" She looked up at him, smiled faintly, and nodded. He stepped back and opened the door. A very attractive woman of about 50 shyly entered the room. Her long hair, a thick mixture of blonde and silver strands, flowed freely over her shoulders. Even at her age, she still had a body that would be the envy of women 20 years younger. "Molly," she greeted softly. "Gwen, please come in." Angie stood up and looked at Molly. Molly smiled encouragingly and nodded. The young blonde turned to her guest again. "I think you can sit here, Mom." "Thank you, Angie." What followed was a chess game between people. Each move of one of the human chess pieces caused the move of another piece. Every advance towards the king led to a counter-counter move to protect him. Finally, silence reigned in the room. Gwen was now sitting on the other side of the bed from Molly and her daughter Jessica. Angie moved to a chair in one corner and Tim sat on a chair in the other corner. "Thank you for letting me come today," Gwen said quietly. "When the kids told me that Joe was going to spend the rest of his time at home, I was forced to ask to see him." "It was the right decision," Molly answered wearily. "I discussed this with Joe and he agreed. He doesn't need visitors once we get him home today, so I'm glad you were able to come before he was discharged." He groaned softly as his eyes slowly opened. Eyes that had not looked at each other for over 10 years now met. "Gwen?" he whispered quietly. "I'm here, Joe," she whispered. "Where is Molly?" "I'm here, honey," his wife said tenderly, stroking his hand. He smiled faintly, looking into his wife's soft brown eyes. Looking around the room, he noticed everyone present. "We gathered here today," he chuckled, hearing several chuckles. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath. He cleared his throat and stared at his ex-wife. "Okay, Gwen," he said weakly. "Say what you need to say. Sorry if I doze off. I can't. Stay conscious." "I understand, Joe," Gwen said. "I'll be brief, but if you fall asleep, please don't worry. Most of what I have to say applies to our children anyway." He nodded, and she took a deep breath. "Joe, I just wanted to say goodbye to you." It was already said, 10 years ago. "Yes," she said with a slight tremble in her voice. "I remember. But when I heard that you were dying, I realized that I still needed to tell you something." "Forgive me," she whispered tensely. "Please, Joe, tell me you forgive me." They looked at each other in silence for a minute before Joe sighed. "You are forgiven," he said softly. Gwen leaned back, clearly surprised by his answer. "Just?" she asked. He snorted. "No, not just like that. It took years to say it and mean it. Molly was the key." He winced in pain and let out a muffled groan. He reached out and pressed the button on the morphine drip. After a few seconds, his breathing deepened and his face visibly relaxed. A few minutes later, he was already asleep. "I'm so sorry, Gwen," Molly said softly. "He'll be gone for a while. I know this probably isn't what you were hoping for." Gwen shook her head. "Actually, it was more than I could have hoped for. I could only dream that he would say that he forgave me. I know I have you to thank for this." "No," Molly said softly, shaking her head. I could never convince Joe to do something he really doesn't want to do. Oh, I know that he will do for me what he prefers not to do, but he will never do what he does not consider right. Well, I'm still grateful that he found someone like you after I lost his love. You didn't lose his love, Mom, Angie hissed. You threw it away? I know, Angie, Gwen answered sadly, and I will regret it for the rest of my days. You also regret it, don't you? Angie snorted and then sat silently, pursing her lips, looking as if she had eaten a lemon. My soul, we all regret things we wish we hadn't done, or things we hoped would have turned out differently. Some of this was beyond our control, and some of it we brought upon ourselves. My biggest regret is that I allowed myself to go crazy during those months. Don't try to make excuses, Angie snapped. No, I didn't say that I am not responsible for my actions, only that at that time my thinking was greatly distorted. A lot was happening then. I doubt you or Tim were aware. I know that neither your father nor I ever told you the details of everything that happened. Joe decided not to do it because he believed that I betrayed him. And not you too, since you were both already out of the house. I never told you about this because, well, because it would have made you hate me, even more than you already do. I don't hate you, Mom, Angie said coldly. I hate what you did, not you. However, I will never sit quietly and listen to someone minimize the extent of the destruction and pain that your betrayal has caused. Angie, Tim, please believe me when I say that. I never thought about how much pain caused my actions. How could you not think, Mom? Tim said calmly from his seat. You should have known that your father's betrayal would hurt him. You and our family meant the world to him. Gwen nodded. You're right. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I ignored the possible consequences. When I allowed myself to think, I immediately realized the danger I was putting my marriage in. Unfortunately, this realization only came when I was already involved in the affair. By then, it was already too late. During the divorce, everyone asked me why I did such a terrible thing. I wish I had a better explanation than the lame excuses I came up with back then. I've had 10 years to analyze my actions, and I believe I now have a better understanding of what happened. It's not an excuse, she said, looking coldly at her daughter. It's just an explanation of how it happened. Until now, I didn't want to admit the reasons because they made me look as selfish and superficial as I was. Simply put, several things happened simultaneously that gave me the opportunity to change Joe, and I arrogantly and foolishly went for it. Gwen, Molly said softly, you are a very beautiful woman. I'm sure that throughout the years of your marriage, you have had many opportunities to break your marital vows. Gwen smiled faintly at her ex-husband's wife. Thanks. And you're right. I've had a lot of opportunities, but not like this. Joe started traveling again after he got a big contract. I knew he took it to help pay for Angie and Tim's college. We discussed it and agreed. It was only for 6 months, but it affected me worse than I could have imagined. When he traveled early in our marriage, I had children to help me cope. Now that they were both in college, I was left alone. I felt so old and lonely. Then at work, a young, handsome man started stalking me. I understood that Douglas was only doing this for sex, but when you get the attention of a beautiful, rising corporate star, it's very flattering. Angie snorted as a pained expression of disappointment appeared on Tim's face. Gwen quickly continued. Like I said, she said calmly, looking at her children, I was arrogant and selfish. I know this doesn't justify what I did, but I hope you can understand how I allowed it to happen. I want you to know that this was never anything that your father did or didn't do. It was my fears and then my ego that opened the door. I never stopped loving him, even during the affair. How can you say that, Mom? Angie grinned. You slept with another man. I know you don't believe it, but it's true. The problem wasn't that I didn't love your father. I loved him. The problem is that I loved myself more. During this time, I put my needs and desires above the needs of my family and your father. For 4 months, I used my feelings of unhappiness to justify betraying my marital vows. When I finally came to my senses, I ended the affair. But the seeds of destruction had already been sown. I hoped that I could come to terms with this and spare your father the pain he would feel when he learned that his wife was a cheating slut. I knew there was a high chance that he would divorce me if he found out." "Then why did you tell him, Mom?" Tim said sadly. "Was it just to ease your guilt?" Angie intervened. "No, honey, that was not the only reason. Yes, my guilt was eating me alive. I knew that your father might have noticed that after that contract, everything had changed. That year after my affair, things between us were so tense at times. I understood that sooner or later, I would have to confess to him. However, fate intervened and did it earlier than I expected. When I broke off my affair with Douglas, I knew that neither of us wanted anyone to know about it. In fact, he had more to lose than me. He was married to the daughter of one of our board members and was a stellar project manager for our corporation. He was going to become the youngest vice president of our corporation. So when I ended the affair, I made one condition. He was never to contact Joe or work with him on any project. In the past, my corporation had repeatedly entered into contracts with your father's company, and I couldn't bear the thought of Joe reporting to Douglas. Douglas will always have the secret knowledge that he slept with me, and he may have influenced your father in some way. I couldn't let him disrespect Joe. Sounds stupid, doesn't it? After all these months of disrespecting your father? Douglas, of course, agreed. It seemed that everything would be fine if I could overcome the guilt. And then this damn government contract appeared. It was potentially worth millions, and I knew Douglas would lead any GSA project if we won it. I also knew that Joe's company would be deeply involved in this project. After we won the tender, my fears were justified. It was announced that Joe would lead the engineering team that was integral to the project. Of course, he will report to the project manager, Douglas. I met with Douglas and reminded him of our agreement, but he told me that business is business and refused to step aside. I think he didn't believe that I would carry out my threat. He was wrong." Gwen paused and took a deep breath. The tears streaming down her face showed the pain the memories caused. "Your father reacted to my confession as I expected. He sat stoically and listened, asking several clarifying questions. I saw how he collected the necessary information before making a decision. When I saw a tear running down his cheek, I realized that everything would end badly for us. The next day, he excluded himself from the team. I don't know if he was trying to take the right path and protect the interests of his company, or if he suspected what would happen when he left. Either way, things couldn't have worked out better for your father as all hell broke loose. He was a key figure on that team, so when he tried to leave, it attracted the attention of everyone, including the big shots at both of our companies. As they began asking questions, their assistants began digging for answers. It didn't take them long to discover Douglas and I's affair, and then the nightmares that tormented me all last year became reality. As I expected, the dollar sign outweighed all the influence of Douglas, and he was removed from the project. However, this benefited Joe and his company. The awkwardness of the situation prompted my corporate management to offer his company a larger percentage of the contract profits, and he ended up getting a promotion. Things weren't going so well for Douglas and me. "What did you expect?" Tim commented coldly. "I didn't expect it, darling," Gwen said softly. "Not even then." The shame of her confession was etched onto her usually beautiful face. It was obvious that she had been carrying this burden for many years. I couldn't even imagine how bad it would be. Douglas and I tried to find other jobs, but found that we were effectively blacklisted. Apparently, Douglas's father-in-law took the shame of his family and daughter very seriously. As a result, Douglas was sent to all sorts of unpleasant projects in the most disadvantaged countries of the Third World. After spending several years jumping from one armpit of the world to another, he finally gave up. He gave his wife a divorce and crawled away with nothing. Last I heard, he was selling insurance in Detroit. Since he was a couple of steps above me in the corporation, he was still considered one of my bosses. I know the company was afraid of being sued, so they promoted me. I was transferred back to some office that would never see the light of day. I don't think I should complain. The money is decent, but my career is essentially over." She paused and looked into the eyes of everyone in the room, as if trying to gauge how they were taking her confession. Jessica narrowed her eyes. It was unpleasant for her to hear how her stepfather had been betrayed. Molly looked worried and wary. It was clear that she already knew most of this. Only the looks of Tim and Angie made her flinch. The resentment and disappointment in their eyes seemed to be beyond her strength. Gradually, she gathered her strength and continued. "If I thought everything was bad at work, then what was happening at home was pure hell. My marriage was falling apart and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Joe sat down and talked to me several times after he filed for divorce. I apologized until I was blue in the face. I told him that none of this was his fault, that it was I who ruined our wonderful marriage. He said he couldn't be too wonderful if he wasn't enough to keep me out of Douglas's bed. It was painful. I understood why he was bitter and why he said it, but it still hurt. Joe asked me why I cheated. My response was simply a string of excuses. After that, he stopped all communication with me. At first, I was angry and upset. I was angry at myself for bringing all of this down on us, and I was disappointed in Joe for not trying to help save the marriage." "Oh, please, Mom," Angie growled. "If Dad cheated on you, would you forgive him and fight for your marriage?" Gwen shook her head slowly and smiled sadly. "We both know the answer to this question, my dear. I would have been much more vindictive and tried to hurt him much more than your father did. Angie, I said I was disappointed, but not because I didn't understand why he reacted the way he did. I didn't really blame him. I was angry because I saw our 20-year marriage going downhill. I knew I had pulled the plug, but I was furious that I couldn't stop it. Only Joe had the opportunity to save him, and he chose not to. You know, if he really wanted to make my life hell, he would have taken me back. There were several sighs. You always knew how to choose words, didn't you, Mom?" Angie grinned. "That's not what I meant. And you know it, Angie," she said, tears in her eyes. "What do you mean, Mom?" Tim asked softly, standing behind her. "I would do anything to show your father how sorry I am for ruining us. I would humiliate myself to the point of disgracing the old Tijuana whore if only he could find a way to love me again. But that evening, when I told him about my betrayal, I realized that this would never happen. Even through my tears, I saw how deeply I had hurt the man I claimed to love. I swear I saw his love for me die right before my eyes. Our marriage was over. I saw it in his eyes. He had to move on, Mom," Tim said softly. "We all did it." "Yes, I know. I also know that I still have some difficulties. You children helped me a lot with this. Oh, I know that at first you were angry with me. No, more like furious. You had every right to do this, but you did not abandon me. I'm not sure I could survive it. I'm grateful to Joe that he didn't turn you against me." "Father would never do that," Tim said calmly. "No," Gwen said, shaking her head. "No, it wouldn't be him." She smiled sadly at her son and then turned to Molly. "Did you know that I was praying that I could somehow get my marriage back? I begged and begged God to somehow change Joe's heart and mind and give me another chance. I know I didn't deserve it, but I wanted it. I clung to this dream for more than a year. Then Angie told me that he started dating you seriously, Molly. It was then that I realized that my prayers would not be answered. Only after you and Joe got married did I seriously try to get my life together. I started dating again, and that's when I learned what kind of marriage I had before I ended it. We had something very good, but I forgot how special he was. But I was reminded of this when I started dating again, God. How I was reminded. I dated quite a bit, but it always led to me comparing him to Joe, and it didn't last long after that. There is a special intimacy between lovers that comes only with time. Only someone who has made love to you many times already knows when you want to be taken by force, with unbridled passion, and when just gentle caresses and a soft kiss will bring you to the limit. You can't imagine how humiliating it is to realize that just because you want your lover to know these things, it won't happen. And not because he doesn't want to, but because he doesn't know you and your body well enough to understand what brings you the most satisfaction at the moment. My nightmare was the realization that I was the reason that these things disappeared. Because of my actions, every romantic relationship I now had was forced to start from scratch. Oh, there have been a few relationships that have seemed promising over the years. 2 of them even ended in proposals, but I rejected both of them. Why? Molly asked, with concern on her face. Why didn't I agree? Gwen took a deep breath. Well, it's a little difficult. One of the reasons was that I still loved my ex-husband. Mother, Angie grumbled. No. Gwen snapped. You can't tell me what I already know very well. There's nothing you can say that I haven't heard and said to myself a million times. None of you can tell me how I feel. I love your father and always will. I know it won't change anything, but I will always feel guilty for what I did. I'm learning to live with these feelings and move on. In some ways I succeeded, but in other areas, I was still stuck. Angie, honey, Molly said softly, trying to calm the situation. It's okay, I'm not jealous. I know how much your dad loves me. Gwen winced slightly. I know that too, Molly, Gwen continued, calming herself. That's why I felt I could make such a statement. I know that his love will remain with you forever. I admit that I am jealous of this, but it was my own doing. Please, I don't want anyone to think that my feelings for Joe were the reason I turned down those marriage proposals. Everything is much deeper. Like everyone here, I wondered. If I truly loved my husband, as I said, then how could I betray him like that? I wish I had an answer I could live with. So, I compared my love for potential suitors to my love for Joe. And since my feelings for each of them were not as strong as for him, I had a problem. If I couldn't be faithful to Joe, how could I promise loyalty to either of them? I cared enough about them to say no to every single one of them. This was the right decision at the time, as it would have been unfair to them. I'm really sorry, Molly said softly. I'm sorry you're going through this. Gwen smiled sadly. It's easy to see why Joe fell in love with you, Molly, she said sadly. You are beautiful both outside and inside. Thank you, but please, Molly said with concern, don't make some kind of saint out of me. I have my regrets, Gwen. Most of them relate to my first marriage, but one in particular relates to Joe. Mother? Asked a worried Jessica. No, it wasn't something terrible, but I'm ashamed of it. Since Gwen speaks so boldly about her regrets, I will try to follow her example. It happened a few months after Joe and I started dating. Our dates were pretty hot and heavy, but we weren't. We weren't. Molly paused, her face contorting as she tried to find the right words. Having sex, Jessica said, smiling. You mean deal with freaks? Angie added with a chuckle. Hide the sausage. Fool around. Girls, Molly gasped. Knock boots? Jessica howled. Hit. Make children? Girls, Molly snapped, her face turning bright red. Tim laughed along with the girls, and Gwen quietly tried to hide her expression of pain. What I wanted to say, Molly said, trying to regain her composure, is that Joe and I haven't had intimacy yet. I knew that for him, and for both of us, this had been a long time coming, and the sexual tension between us was making things more complicated. And then I overheard a phone call. It was clear that Molly was beginning to feel uneasy. Taking a deep breath, she continued. I heard Joe talking to someone. At first I thought it was you, Angie. But now I realize I don't know who it was. But whoever it was, Joe was talking about a possible reconciliation with Gwen. I knew I loved Joe, but I was still very scared after the disaster of my first marriage. Even though my first husband left us 9 years ago, I have never let a man as close to me as Joe. I knew that he was a good person, that he would be a good father and a wonderful husband. So I decided that he was mine. That week, I shamelessly attacked him, trying to capture him and keep his attention only on me. In short, I seduced him. Mom, Jessica said, smiling. I highly doubt it took much seduction to get my father's attention. I mean, damn it. Every time I saw you two, you kept touching each other. Seriously, Molly, Angie added. It seems like Daddy could never keep his hands off you. Your father was always very affectionate, Molly answered. Jessica snorted, and Angie and Tim smiled. Is affectionate another word for excited? Jessica grinned. Jess, Molly scolded. The three grown children laughed. Gwen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mom, Jessica said, still smiling, I don't understand why you regret showing the man you love how much you wanted him. Dear, I don't regret this. I only regret that the fear of losing him led me to this. And I also wonder what would have happened if I had not done this. Would Joe wait for me? Would he return to Gwen? Whatever happened, I would hope he was happy. I know I was more than happy with our life together. Molly, Tim said softly. Dad always said that you and Jess saved him. Molly nodded and laughed softly. I know that's true, she said warmly, but in fact he saved us too. After my ex left, I had serious trust issues. I dated on and off for almost 10 years, but these problems kept getting in my way. It was difficult for me to believe that a man needed me not only for sex, and then Joe dispelled these misconceptions. Well, Jess grinned, looking at her grinning stepsister. What? Molly asked, confusion written all over her face. Of course, Dad wanted more from you than just sex? Of course I did, honey. Oh, God. Tim, Angie, and Jess laughed as they watched Molly's face turn bright red again. Jessica Patterson, behave, she answered, holding back a she smile. Your father's love was much more than just that. He is a good man and a wonderful father. Even when he first got sick, he still took care of us. I couldn't have prayed for a better, more loving husband. He has made the last 8 years happier than I could have ever imagined. I never thought Joe would seriously consider reconciling with me, Gwen said quietly. I wonder who he could talk to about something so personal. Well, since today is apparently Jerry Springer Family Confession Day, Angie said sarcastically, it was probably me. My dad and I had several conversations on this topic. I had no idea that you were so involved in his decisions at the time, Molly said softly. Angie sighed, looked at Jess, then back at Molly. More than you can imagine, Angie answered calmly. I knew that Dad was at a crossroads then, live in the past or move forward. He said he was falling in love with you, Molly, and if he didn't break up with you, he might ask you to marry him. He said that he still had feelings for his mother. He told me that you can't be married to someone for that long and not have feelings for her. I asked him about these feelings. He said that if before it was almost pure love, now it is a mixture of love and hatred, anger and bitterness, fatigue and despair. He was unsure whether to go back and try to deal with these feelings or start over. Naturally, since I was trying to set him up with Molly, I pushed him into it. Have you tried to set him up with other women? Gwen said sadly. I didn't think you hated me so much. Mom, like I said, I don't hate you, but it wasn't about you. It was about Dad. I saw what your betrayal did to him. It almost killed him. On the outside, he might appear strong and calm, but on the inside, he was bleeding. I stayed with him that summer after you told him about your affair. It was a month after your confession and all hell broke loose. I can't tell you how many times I went up to his room to check on him and heard him cry. He didn't cry in front of me, but when he was alone in his room, he gave vent to pain. I sat quietly outside his door in the corridor and cried with him. Tears filled Gwen's eyes, and she slowly shook her head. I never knew, she said quietly. I knew I hurt him, but I never saw any signs of his pain other than his occasional outbursts of anger. That's because he didn't want you to see it. He didn't want you to feel the satisfaction of knowing how much you hurt him. I never wanted to hurt him like that. I was selfish and focused entirely on what I wanted and needed, but I didn't maliciously try to hurt your father. Whether you did it intentionally or just out of your stupidity doesn't really matter, Mom. The fact is that you did it. So when he was faced with a choice, go back to the wife who cheated on him and poisoned years of good memories, or start over with a woman who loved him and would never cheat on him. I insisted on the latter. We all know it would take months or years of working on trust issues before he could relax and be happy with you again, Mom. So hell yeah, I insisted he start over with Molly. I actually regret a little that I manipulated him, and I even somehow feel bad that I had a hand in ensuring that you two were no longer together. But to be honest, Mom, it wasn't about you anymore. It was about my father's happiness, and I believed and still believe that he was happier with Molly than going back and trying to overcome all this nonsense of rebuilding his marriage with you. Angie, I had no idea you played the role of matchmaker so well, Molly interjected gently. I'm torn between scolding you and hugging you and thanking you. Well, Jessica chimed in, she didn't do it all alone. I have my own confession to add to all this. Jess? Molly asked in surprise. Mom, you know that I met Angie in college. She was a senior who studied with me in my first year. We became friends, and it didn't hurt that she had a cute little brother a couple of years older than me. She looked at Tim and smiled sadly, and then turned back to her mother. I still lived at home, and Angie came to see me several times. I could tell she was watching you very carefully. When I talked to her about it, she shared her thoughts that you and her father would be the perfect couple. I was planning to move to campus next year and was worried that you would be alone. I guess that's when we conspired to find a way to bring you together to see if there was any chemistry between you. I met Tim several times before Angie invited me to spend the weekend at their house. When I first met my dad, Joe, I immediately fell in love with him. Angie snorted with laughter. She fell in love with him almost as quickly as you did, Molly, Angie snorted. Bullshit, Jessica snapped, smiling. I fell in love with him at least a full week faster than my mother. It took her so long to pull her head out of her ass and accept the fact that she loved him too. Jess, tongue, Molly stated firmly and allowed herself a small smirk. Jessica playfully stuck her tongue out at her mother and smiled innocently. In general, since I was hooked, we began to plan how to bring you together. Angie came up with the idea to invite you and me over for the weekend. I'm sorry to say that to cover up our plan, we used the story that I loved Tim very much and wanted to introduce my mother to him. Jessica turned to Tim. Sorry, Tim. I don't think I ever apologized to you for making it seem like I took us more seriously than I actually did. You were a great guy when we were dating, and I was obviously very attracted to you, but you weren't in love with me, I know, Tim intervened. At first I couldn't understand what was happening. I knew that I liked you more than you liked me, but that first visit to my home was a surprise to me. Then, when I saw you with your father, I became even more confused. I won't say that a guy's ego doesn't suffer when his girlfriend falls in love with his father more than with him, but after your next visit with your mother, I finally understood everything. Until this moment, I was afraid that I had fallen in love with a girl with serious problems with her own father. Well, Jessica laughed. Probably, in some sense, it is. I don't know many 19-year-olds who change their last name when their mother remarries. Even though we had never lived under the same roof before, he was more of a father to me than any other man. Well, Tim chuckled, after I saw your mother and watched your father's reaction to her and you, it became quite obvious. I had already forgotten how long it had been since I had seen him smile and laugh like that. The silence in the room was filled with both smiles of memories and anxious regrets. Well, Tim said quietly, since everyone else has admitted to some deep, dark secret, I guess it's my turn now. When all eyes turned to him, Tim cleared his throat. I just wanted to let you know that you'll probably read something in the newspapers next week that might upset you. And yes, it's true. I am the lost Kardashian sister, and I recently got engaged to Caitlyn Marie Jenner. Jerk, Angie snorted. The room was filled with sporadic laughter, a stark contrast to the previous mood. Just like his father, Gwen and Molly said at the same time. Both women looked at each other in surprise before Tim intervened again. Thank you, he said, smiling warmly. I couldn't think of a better compliment. The room's giggles gradually died down, and an awkward silence reigned before Gwen stood up gracefully. Molly? She smiled sadly. Thank you again for letting me come here today. I'm still trying to move on with my life. This meeting was a big step for me. Thank you for allowing it to happen. You're welcome, Gwen, and I hope you can move on and have a wonderful life. It was mostly Joe's decision, although we both felt something good could come out of it. If he didn't think so, I wouldn't agree. I won't let anyone hurt my husband. I wish, Gwen whispered, I wish I could be as passionately devoted. She looked at her son. Tim, will you take me to the hotel? He nodded and gathered his things. Gwen looked back at the frail man sleeping on the bed. Molly, please tell Joe he's in my prayers, just like you and Jessica. I'll pass it on, and thank you. Gwen turned and slowly walked out of the room. As soon as she was on the other side of the door, tears streamed down her face, and she sobbed softly. She realized that this was the last time she would see the love of her life alive. 2.5 weeks later, Joseph Randall Patterson, 53, died. He died in his sleep, at home, surrounded by his loving family. The funeral service was bittersweet. Molly sat between Jessica and Angie in the front row. To the surprise of some in attendance, Gwen also sat in the front row between Angie and Tim. After the service, friends and family offered their condolences and then left for a family reception. All 3 grown children now surrounded Molly as she stood outside the limousine. Molly, Angie said tenderly, I want to thank you again. I never thought I'd see Dad smile again after the divorce, but you and Jess brought that back into his life. You reminded him that he could love again, and there was no doubt that he loved you both. Molly reached out and gently took her hand. Never forget how much he loved you and Tim. He was always so proud of you both. We know, Tim said, smiling sadly, but divorces make them hard for everyone. Even though Angie and I had already left home, their divorce was difficult for us. We wanted to be close to Dad because he was so hurt and angry, but we couldn't be there every day. We are so grateful that he found you. Angie and I also want to thank you for the way you treated your mom these past few weeks. You allowed her to say goodbye to her dad and be a part of celebrating his life today. Not many people would allow their ex-spouse to do this. Oh, honey, your father and I knew this was important to Angie and you, as well as your mother. It means more than you think, Angie added softly. When Dad fell in love with you, he was able to move on with his life, but Mom couldn't. I hope that you and Dad letting her say goodbye will help her. Molly, not only did you give my dad a new lease of life, but you may have enabled my mom to do the same. Your father and I love you both so much, Molly began to say, but her voice broke. I love both of you. Molly tried to suppress her sobs as she leaned against the limousine. Tears began to stream down her face. I will miss him very much, she sobbed. Tim stepped forward and hugged her as she buried her face in his chest and burst into tears. Both young women held each other as they watched her mourn the loss of her love. Gradually, she came to her senses, and everyone turned their attention to a lonely woman kneeling next to the grave. Not paying attention to those present, the woman quietly sobbed. She gently stroked the cold marble tombstone, whispering words addressed to the man she had once called her husband. Angie and Tim silently walked over and stood on either side of their mother. Mom, Angie whispered tenderly. Time to go. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.